So hello everyone, and welcome to our panel on nuclear dangers. This is part of a series of discussions on the nuclear dangers arising from Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Our purpose is to bring concerns about nuclear dangers to greater public awareness, in keeping with the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation's central mission of promoting nuclear abolition. And thank you again. Today, we're joined by an esteemed group of experts, including John Burroughs, who is a senior analyst from the New York City-based Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, Jacqueline Cabasso, who is the executive director of the California-based Western States Legal Foundation, and Andrew Lichterman, who is a senior analyst for Western States Legal Foundation. They will be talking about three items. First will be Russia's invasion of Ukraine and accompanying nuclear threats with reference to international law. Then whether geopolitical analysis is the appropriate framework. And then finally, divergent approaches of peace advocates. We will do Q&A at the end of the event. So I'd like to first introduce John Burroughs from the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, who will talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and accompanying nuclear threats with reference to international law. So please, John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. And hello, participants, many of whom I know. I'll start with the basics. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an aggressive war in violation of the UN Charter, as recognized by the UN General Assembly and by the International Court of Justice. Russia is therefore obligated to cease military operations as the Assembly and Court demanded, and withdraw its forces from Ukraine as the Assembly demanded. Russia has refused to acknowledge that obligation and continues to wage war, and recently has purported to annex parts of eastern and southern Ukraine after transparently illegitimate referenda. The purported annexation of Ukrainian territory underlines the wrongfulness and illegality of Russia's war of aggression. Article 2 of the UN Charter prohibits member states from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. In 1974, the UN General Assembly adopted by consensus a definition of aggression. Heading the list of acts constituting aggressions was, quote, the invasion or attack by the armed forces of the territory of another state or any military occupation, however temporary, resulting from such invasion or attack, or any annexation by the use of force of the territory of another state or part thereof. The definition further states that no territorial acquisition or special advantage resulting from aggression is or shall be recognized as lawful. The definition of aggression in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court closely tracks the 1974 UN General Assembly resolution. All of this, in the end, dates back to the aftermath of World War II, when the Nuremberg Tribunal declared aggression the supreme crime, forming the basis for other crimes, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Following Russian vetoes of Security Council resolutions demanding Russia's withdrawal from Ukraine, the General Assembly has now adopted 3 resolutions making the same demand. In the third resolution on October 12th, the Assembly declared the purported annexations to be invalid under international law. 143 governments voted in favor of the resolution, 35 abstained, and 5 states voted against it. I will not try to address prospects for and elements of a ceasefire or a permanent settlement. But I do want to underline that the US role in ending the war can be crucial. The United States should do all within its power to help bring the war to a close rapidly in order to limit suffering, to eliminate risks that the conflict will widen and escalate, possibly to nuclear war, and to limit the negative global economic and food security repercussions. This implies that the United States and other states must be ready to lift war-related sanctions in connection with the settlement. It also implies that they must be prepared to accept and support some form of neutrality for Ukraine, should Ukraine choose that. A broader reason for determined efforts to end the war is the need to work towards restoring a relationship with Russia, enabling cooperation on nuclear arms control and disarmament, climate protection, public health, and other vital matters of global concern. US energy in helping bring the war to a close is also appropriate in view of the political responsibility of the United States, together with NATO, since the late 1990s, in helping to create the conditions for a crisis by taking such actions as precipitously withdrawing from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2003, subsequently establishing missile defense facilities in Romania and Poland, and opening the door to Ukraine's membership in NATO in 2008. Now let me talk about nuclear threats. Russia, on more than one occasion, has referred to Russian resort to nuclear weapons should the United States and NATO states intervene militarily in the conflict. Notably, on the day of the invasion of Ukraine, February 24th of this year, Putin said, "For those who may be tempted to interfere in these developments from the outside, they must know that Russia will respond immediately and the consequences will be such as you have never seen in your entire history." That statement, without question, is a legally cognizable threat, both credible and specific in form. In a concrete context, one of armed conflict, the message is, if you do not refrain from X or if you do Y, we will resort to nuclear arms. Disturbingly, at the end of September, Putin made remarks indicating that the nuclear threat extends beyond the survival of the Russian state to protection of Russian territorial integrity, including the regions of Ukraine purportedly annexed in September. If a use of force would violate the UN Charter, a threat to engage in such force violates the Charter. As the International Court of Justice stated broadly in its 1996 Nuclear Weapons Advisory Opinion, quote, "The notions of threat and use of force under Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter stand together in the sense that if the use of force itself in a given case is illegal for whatever reason, the threat to use such force will likewise be illegal." It follows that under the Charter, a threat to use nuclear weapons as part of an aggressive attack is illegal. Any threat to use nuclear weapons, whether aggressive or defensive, must also be of a use that would comply with the law applicable to the conduct of hostilities by both sides, or international humanitarian law, IHL. In general, as the International Court of Justice found, quote, "If an envisaged use of weapons would not meet the requirements of humanitarian law, a threat to engage in such use would also be contrary to that law." Close quote. The illegality of a threat to use nuclear weapons under IHL therefore depends on the illegality of the use. We summarize the main points and sources for the illegality of nuclear use in the Lawyers' Committee on Nuclear Policy paper, "End the War, Stop the War Crimes." Key rules of IHL require that civilians and civilian infrastructure not be attacked, forbid indiscriminate attacks, require proportionality, and require taking precautions to meet those requirements. I'm not going to dive into this in depth. I will just say, in short, nuclear weapons cannot be used in compliance with those rules. Given the illegality of use of nuclear weapons under IHL, under the general principle stated by the ICJ, threats to use such weapons are also illegal. So in summary, Russian threats to use nuclear arms are illegal first because they are an element of the unlawful invasion in violation of the UN Charter. They seek to shield unlawful Russian conventional military operations by deterring NATO states from a direct military intervention to assist in Ukraine's lawful self-defense pursuant to Article 51 of the Charter. Such an intervention would be lawful if requested by Ukraine. This feature, the integration of threats to use nuclear weapons into an actual and aggressive attack, distinguishes the Russian invasion of Ukraine from episodes in recent years involving threats of use of nuclear weapons. A frightening such episode was the 2017 exchange of nuclear threats by the United States and North Korea. Importantly, and as I've already tried to explain, in addition, threats to use nuclear weapons are illegal under law governing the conduct of warfare, regardless of whether the circumstance is one in which the threat is made by an aggressor state or a state acting in self-defense. Russia's threats are illegal in that respect as well. So what are the institutional responses, the possible institutional responses to the war? The most important thing to do is to bring the war to an end, as I have already said. That, unfortunately, has been made more difficult by the purported annexation of regions of Ukraine, a position which will be hard for a Russian government to reverse in any permanent settlement. But it is also worth considering possible legal and institutional responses to Russian aggression and nuclear threats. In the International Criminal Court, when jurisdiction is established, individuals can be prosecuted for war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and aggression. Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute creating the International Criminal Court. Under the statute's rules regarding aggression, the ICC consequently does not have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression with respect to Russia. However, pursuant to a declaration made by Ukraine in 2014, the ICC appears to have jurisdiction over war crimes committed by both sides on Ukrainian territory. That would extend to any use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine by Russia. Regarding aggression, the establishment of a special tribunal on aggression has been proposed, and it's been seriously proposed. That could be done by the General Assembly, or failing that, by ad hoc groups of states, or possibly an entity such as the Council of Europe. Because nuclear threats are an element of Russia's war of aggression, they would, or at least should, be considered by such a tribunal. If Russia uses nuclear weapons, a tribunal could be given authority to prosecute individuals for such use as well. Another possibility, especially in response to a nuclear use, is the suspension of Russia's membership rights in the UN, notably its ability to vote and to veto as a permanent member of the Security Council. Russia has now vetoed several Security Council resolutions demanding that Russia cease its aggression and withdraw from Ukraine. However, the UN Charter poses obstacles to suspending the voting rights of a permanent member. It appears to set a recommendation of the Security Council, which could be vetoed by Russia, as a condition for General Assembly suspension or expulsion of a member. Still, if there was an overwhelming majority of UN membership in favor of suspension of voting rights, including all or most members of the Security Council except Russia, suspension might nonetheless be recognized as legitimate and legal in accordance with the purposes and principles of the UN. So far, China, which is a permanent member, and India, joined by two other members whose identities vary, have abstained on council resolutions regarding the invasion. I have no idea what their position would be regarding a Russian nuclear use. It would be important to somehow signal, if only informally, the possibility of restricting Russian membership rights in advance of any possible nuclear use to help dissuade Russia from taking that step. There is, of course, more to be said regarding the international legal landscape, but I will stop here.
Thank you, John, for those comments. And as I mentioned previously, we'll have a Q&A session afterwards, at the end of the presentations. So next we'll have Andrew Lichterman, who is a senior research analyst. He's a senior research analyst for Western States Legal Foundation. And as a lawyer, he has represented peace and environmental activists in a variety of settings and also taught law at alternative law schools for many years. He will be talking about whether geopolitical analysis is the appropriate framework. Please, Andy, the floor is yours.
The Ukraine war marks a profound shift in global affairs, one whose nature cannot yet be fully understood. In the near term, it has resulted in setbacks not only for peace, but for many aspects of work for a more fair and peaceful global society in balance with the ecological limits of the planet. In regard to work for nuclear disarmament, we are seeing threats to use nuclear weapons shaping a war crisis to an extent not seen since the depths of the Cold War. The decision by the Russian government to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine came as a surprise to most. I did not expect this war, nor do I see easy answers for what to do about it. It has also brought significant divisions among those who long have opposed war. For me, this suggests that we need to rethink some of the assumptions and frames of reference we use to understand the world and to guide our work. It is a truism that how we talk about things shapes how we think about them. So today, I will be addressing how we talk and think about this war more than about the conclusions I think that we should reach. The first step is consciously thinking from the perspective of peace movements, not of governments. An obstacle to this is that much of the public discourse about matters of war and peace today, even in anti-war circles, is conducted in the language of geopolitics, which is rooted in the perspective of governments. It is a language that portrays countries as the actors, describing the actions of the United States or Russia. Naming states as unitary actors implies that they are adequate and legitimate representatives of all who reside within their boundaries. Geopolitical thought is a top-down perspective in which the interests and conflicts of a few great powers take center stage, and the actions and intentions of all other people and governments are pushed to the margin. Viewing countries and their national interests as...
Sorry, Andrew, I'm just going to tell everyone to mute themselves. Sorry. There we go. Apologies there.
Viewing countries and their national interests as undivided units also obscures the societal dynamics that make the rulers of countries more likely to choose the path of war. We need to develop again different, more specific language to talk about governments, how they wield their power, and who really has the power to affect their decisions. For a start, the labels for the actors in this language should not be just the names of states. we need to try to be more specific. At minimum, we should say Russia's government or the US government. Where possible, we should try to be more specific still, identifying the organizations and interests contending to gain, influence, and exercise state power. If we can't do that, it means we have more analytical work to do. Even such preliminary clumsy efforts to revise the conventions of how we talk about international affairs and wars matter. They remind us for a moment that the Russian people are not our enemy. They also encourage us to consider that people who live within the current internationally recognized borders of Ukraine who speak Russian may not want to be governed by those who now rule in Russia. They may lead us to contemplate the possibility that most people living in either Russia or Ukraine would not consider each other enemies without strenuous efforts by their rulers to convince them it was so, or unless the government of one of those countries launched a war that left people in the other with few choices but to fight, flee, or face military occupation. In the longer view, we must understand that nation states are made things. Their prototypes were forged in the crucible of European state building, colonialism, and inter-imperial competition. Their national myths and narratives of the self-proclaimed great powers were shaped to justify the exploitation, enslavement, and extermination of other peoples, and to mobilize against one another for war. Geopolitical thought took shape at the beginning of the 20th century in this context, as the theory and practice of imperialist competition and colonialism, and never has strayed far from its roots. The more schematic versions of international relations realism, the kind we are most likely to hear from many of the experts, whether on news shows or on anti-war webinars, share similar assumptions about the eternal and inevitable competition among nations. One critic has described this kind of approach as a theoretical articulation of the spontaneous ideology of state managers. We should understand the way geopolitical thought frames events at most as describing an existing state of affairs, not as an account of how things should or must be. Geopolitical theories focus mainly on competition among the most powerful states for control of space and resources. In doing so, geopolitical thinking discounts the aspirations and voice of the people who don't live in so-called great powers. Their countries are conceived as something to be bartered or fought over, valued only for their resources or cheap labor pools or subaltern militaries, or as buffer zones against attack by some other great power. Viewing the world through this kind of lens has led much of the anti-war discourse about Ukraine since 2014 to focus mainly on NATO expansion and on the confrontation between the United States and Russia. NATO countries, including the former Soviet republics and Warsaw Pact countries that have become NATO members, often are portrayed mainly as either object of or instruments in this struggle. This framing has been accentuated by the nuclear weapons aspects of the US-Russia confrontation, with the US and Russian militaries having over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. As a result, I think we paid too little attention to the demand side of NATO expansion, to the reasons people and governments in the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact countries might have believed that they needed protection from possible aggression by the Russian government. Thinking more about that might have made this war less of a surprise. And in US anti-war discourse, we seldom see the voices of Ukraine's independent left, critical both of the Western and Russian governments, acknowledged, much less cited. Portraying states as unitary actors also obscures the reality that governments often choose courses of action that work for their immediate strategies of rule, but are a disaster for most of their people. Geopolitical thinking elides the economic, political, and ideological dynamics that create the conditions in which those who rule choose war. These considerations are reduced to the status of inputs or constraints, just ammunition or obstacles for the fundamental task of building and deploying the competitive powers of the state. I think bringing these factors back in Giving them more weight is essential to understanding the forces driving the Ukraine war and the dangers of more wars to come. We need to start talking again about who actually rules and what their interests are, not just in the United States and the West, but everywhere. NATO expansion was not the sole cause of the Ukraine war and may not have been the main one. There was more to criticize about the response of decision makers in the United States and its allies to the collapse of the Soviet Union than NATO expansion. Their economic policies played a significant role in shaping the governments that emerged in the post-Soviet states, including in Russia. Shock treatment economics pushed by Western governments and profiteering by Western corporations encouraged the looting of what economic assets remained viable and contributed to the emergence of a brutally competitive economic and political landscape. Those who rule in the United States and their European partners help to shape an enemy in their own image, or perhaps the image of their past of authoritarian nationalist capitalism. Today, the economic and political elites of all the states involved in this conflict are fully engaged as participants in the competitive dynamics of this phase of global capitalism. The ruling groups that emerged in many post-Soviet states, including both Russia and Ukraine, deployed identity-based nationalisms to a greater or lesser extent to gain power, and then as part of their strategies of rule. These nationalist currents have been reinforced by the broader global resurgence of authoritarian nationalisms and by the deeper forces driving that resurgence, and also playing a role in driving the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Nationalisms are ideological tools deployed to contend for, consolidate, and sustain state power. Newly independent Ukraine was a fluid, multicultural polity, its national identity ripe for contestation. Constellations of oligarchs emerged there as elsewhere across the post-Soviet space. Their internecine competition dominated Ukraine's politics. Their economic interests and regional political bases were variously aligned with their counterparts in Russia or with financial, corporate, and government institutions and interests in Europe and the United States. Linguistic nationalisms became prominent instruments in their struggles for rule, encouraged and reinforced by patrons in both Russia and the West. None of the forces outside Ukraine had a legal or moral right to determine its future. And certainly, none had the right to attempt to settle the matter by launching a war that would devastate the country, killing many thousands of the people who lived there. This is the context in which the Yanukovych government fell in 2014. It is a story considerably more complex than the account often repeated by US anti-war activists that the cause was a neo-Nazi coup instigated by the government of the United States. And this is the context in which we must understand the broader nationalist and revanchist narrative put forward by the Russian government as another element of its justification for war. This war also should remind us that identity-based nationalisms have a history of taking on an ideological power of their own, one that can narrow the political options of those rulers who invoke them. Similar nationalist currents are ascendant in many countries with a corrosive effect on political stability and on what democracy has been achieved. The United States is a leading example of this. Most of the nuclear-armed countries now have authoritarian nationalist governments or have identity-based nationalist movements with significant influence. It is easy to see other flashpoints where governments playing or overplaying the nationalism card could spark other wars involving nuclear-armed states, from South Asia to the Koreas to Taiwan. These dangers are exacerbated as governments more explicitly blur the line between military and economic competition. Nationalisms may not be the fundamental driver of renewed arms racing and war risk, but as has happened in the past, they may still be war's proximate cause. On the movement building front, a conversation about the reasons for the resurgence of authoritarian identity-based nationalisms in this moment could be a step towards connecting work for peace with other issues and movements. For a wide range of affected communities and human rights movements, identity-based nationalisms pose an immediate threat. The civilizational crisis of ecological overshoot will require unprecedented levels of global cooperation if we are to avoid disaster. Nationalism's heighten barriers to cooperation necessary to address the ecological crisis. And nationalist problems for competitive growth are driven by imperatives often at odds with necessary transition efforts. Understanding why such ideologies are resurgent as the long cycle of neoliberal globalization reaches its limits can help us better understand the political dynamics that drive the greatest dangers of our time. I will now hand it over to Jackie, who among other things will talk about some of the places these cross-issue conversations we need can happen.
So just Jackie, first thank you, Andy, for your remarks. I think it's absolutely crucial that we look, that we analyze the situation in Russia in terms of a constructivist point of view and how different dynamics are playing out. Now I would like to introduce Jackie. Jacqueline Cabasso is the executive director of the California-based Western States Legal Foundation, an executive advisor of Mayors for Peace. She has a long record of engagement and leadership in peace and disarmament movements and organizations, and currently she's also the national co-convener of United for Peace and Justice, which was formed to oppose the US-UK invasion of Iraq. And she's part of the coordinating committee for Abolition 2000's global network to eliminate nuclear weapons. So I'd like to give the floor to Jacqueline Cabasso for her remarks on divergent approaches of peace advocates. Please, Jackie.
Okay. Thank you, Christian, and thank you, Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. And hello to the many friends I recognize in the participant list. Reading the accounts coming out of Russia and Ukraine, I'm reminded of this 1943 quote by George Orwell in looking back on the Spanish Civil War. He wrote, quote, "I saw newspaper reports which did not bear any relation to the facts, not even the relationship which is implied in an ordinary lie. I saw great battles reported where there had been no fighting, and complete silence where hundreds of men had been killed. I saw troops who had fought bravely denounced as cowards and traitors, and others who had never seen a shot fired hailed as the heroes of imaginary victories. And I saw newspapers in London retailing these lies and eager intellectuals building emotional superstructures over events that had never happened," end quote. In addition to the horrific, totally unnecessary bloodshed and suffering in Ukraine, as someone who has spent my entire adult life working for the elimination of nuclear weapons and war, Russia's illegal war of aggression on Ukraine deeply pains me for two reasons. First, the conflict has once again raised the specter of nuclear war, a very real and ever-present possibility groups, including Western States Legal Foundation, have been raising for decades, continuing after the end of the Cold War, when nuclear weapons fell off the public's radar screen. Unfortunately, nuclear threats have become increasingly routine. When leaders of nuclear-armed states declare all options are on the table, a nuclear threat is often implied. Every time a nuclear-armed state test launches a nuclear-capable missile, every time a nuclear-armed state flies a nuclear-capable bomber near or over the territory of another nuclear-armed state, and every time a nuclear-armed state or alliance engages in massive military exercises, including nuclear drills, these are all implicit nuclear threats and are understood as such by potential adversaries. In recent years, these veiled threats have become more explicit. I was in Japan in August 2017 when Donald Trump issued his fire and fury warning, quote, North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire, fury, and frankly power the likes of which this world has never seen before, end quote. It was the lead news story in Japan, and people were terrified. Then Defense Secretary Leon Panetta warned of the possibility of nuclear war. It seems that Vladimir Putin has taken a page out of Trump's playbook with his warnings against Western intervention in Ukraine. John read this quote, but it's worth repeating. Quote, no matter who tries to stand in our way, or all the more so create threats for our country and our people, they must know that Russia will respond immediately, and the consequences will be such as you have never seen in your entire history, end quote. Despite Russian officials' claims to the contrary, there is no doubt that he is signaling Russia's readiness to carry out a devastating nuclear strike. That doesn't mean he's decided to do so, but in the fog of war and propaganda surrounding the Russian invasion of Ukraine, any number of foreseeable and unforeseeable developments could spiral out of control and lead to a nuclear weapons use. Let's also remember that nuclear weapons are already being used by Russia, the US, and NATO to provide top cover for their conventional military operations. Last year, Admiral Charles Richard, head of US Strategic Command, wrote, quote, we must acknowledge the foundational nature of our nation's strategic nuclear forces as they create the maneuver space for us to project conventional military power strategically, end quote. As we can see, this is certainly true for Russia. Richard also warned, quote, there is a real possibility that a regional crisis with Russia or China could quickly escalate to a conflict involving nuclear weapons if they perceived a conventional loss would threaten the regime or state, end quote. February 15th, 2003 was a global day of protest. The world says no to war. United for Peace and Justice helped coordinate and publicize nearly 800 demonstrations worldwide and organized a rally at United Nations headquarters in New York City that drew more than 500,000 people. The New York Times called us the world's second superpower. Alas, we failed to stop the illegal US war of aggression on Iraq. While early on we saw outpourings of peace movement and public condemnation of Russia's actions in many countries, we did not see the same unified reaction in the US. Instead, the war has revealed deep divisions among the fragments of the anti-war movement, with some characterizing the war as a NATO war of aggression on Ukraine, and excusing Russia's behavior by literally recycling talking points provided by Russian state media and even its Ministry of Defense as facts. As Andy explained, indeed, the governments of the United States and its allies bear responsibility for refusing to include the post-Soviet Russian government in security arrangements that would allow it to feel secure within its borders. They also imposed capitalist economic policies that helped shape the governments that emerged in Russia and other post-Soviet states in their own image. Russia relied on assurances from the US government and its allies that NATO would not be expanded to the east. Instead, NATO has expanded to include former Soviet republics and Warsaw Pact countries, leaving open the possibility of membership for Georgia and Ukraine. But this does not excuse or justify Russia's illegal war of aggression. The people of Ukraine are bearing the brunt of the violence, and they find themselves at the center of a crisis that could draw the militaries of the United States, its NATO allies, and Russia into direct conflict. In 1967, I.F. Stone said, quote, all governments lie, but disaster lies in wait for countries whose officials smoke the same hashish they give out, end quote. So I would like to pose a few questions to us as peace activists and as human beings. Why would we condemn an illegal war of aggression on Iraq by the United States, but not condemn an illegal war of aggression by Russia on Ukraine? Why would we condemn US capitalism, imperialism, and rising fascism, and not question Russian capitalism, imperialism, and rapidly escalating fascism? Why would we accept Russian government propaganda at face value while contesting US government propaganda? And why wouldn't we stand in full solidarity with the hundreds of thousands of brave Russian war resistors who have stood up against their government's war of aggression, with large numbers refusing to fight and even leaving the country, as our own draft resistors did in protest of the US war in Vietnam? In 1982, at the height of the Cold War, Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme's Independent Commission on Disarmament and Security Issues published a report which introduced the concept of common security, the notion that nations and peoples can only feel safe when their counterparts feel safe. To mark the 40th anniversary of this landmark report, the Olof Palme International Center, International Peace Bureau, and International Trade Union Confederation issued a new report called Common Security 2022 for Our Shared Future. It begins, quote, "The world stands at a crossroads, faced with a choice between an existence based on confrontation and aggression, or one to be rooted in a transformative peace agenda and common security. In 2022, humanity faces the existential threats of nuclear war, climate change, and pandemics. This is compounded by a toxic mix of inequality, extremism, nationalism, gender violence, and shrinking democratic space. How humanity responds to these threats will decide our very survival." I believe that humanity must include all of us from all walks of life, wherever we live. We cannot leave our future survival to governments. To assume our responsibilities as human beings and non-state actors, I think we need to return to the basic precepts of nonviolence and human security. In 1946, Albert Einstein sent a fundraising appeal to prominent Americans asking for contributions, quote, "to let the people know that a new type of thinking is essential," end quote, in the atomic age. Einstein's telegram included his prophetic warning, quote, "The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything save our modes of thinking, and we thus drift towards unparalleled catastrophe," end quote. From this and other statements, the new thinking Einstein was calling for was to abandon competition and preparation for war, and to focus instead on cooperation and the peaceful resolution of conflicts. It was good advice then, now more timely than ever. I hope we can all agree with the US Conference of Mayors, which in June 2022 adopted a resolution submitted by US members of Mayors for Peace, quote, "calling on the President and Congress to exercise restraint in US military engagement in Ukraine while maximizing diplomatic efforts to end the war as soon as possible by working with Ukraine and Russia to reach an immediate ceasefire and negotiate with mutual concessions in conformity with the United Nations Charter, knowing that the risks of wider war grow the longer the war continues," end quote. But it's very difficult to know what we can do to make this happen, and I have no ready answers for the short term. With Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine, the specter of nuclear war has risen to the highest level since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which, by the way, is marking its 60th anniversary today. With the existential threats of nuclear war and climate crisis, rising authoritarian nationalisms, and democracy under attack around the world, we're in a civilizational emergency. It seems clear to me that new thinking is not only an order, but an imperative. As Robert Goldston, a professor at Princeton University, wrote in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, quote, "The US policy goal the day after the war in Ukraine ends should be to assure that the circumstances that gave rise to that devastating war should never recur," end quote. While nuclear weapons represent the ultimate form of violence, Coretta Scott King, widow of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and a founder of the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, just months after her husband's assassination, powerfully illuminated the thread of violence that runs between US, and not only US, foreign and domestic policies. Quote, "I must remind you that a starving child is violence. Neglecting school children is violence. Punishing a mother and her family is violence. Discrimination against a working man is violence. Ghetto housing is violence. Ignoring medical need is violence. Contempt for poverty is violence," end quote. But understanding that the violence in our society runs both ways, as early as 1959, Dr. King, better known for his championship of civil rights, in an address to the War Resisters League declared, quote, "No sane person can afford to work for social justice within the nation unless he simultaneously resists war and clearly declares himself for nonviolence in international relations," end quote. It's all connected. Finally, I want to challenge the concept of national security that is drummed into our heads 24/7 by our governments and the media. In a post-Cold War presentation to NGOs, Dr. Mahbub ul Haq, head of the United Nations Development Program, spoke eloquently of the need for a fundamental transformation in the context of security, which he described as, quote, the security of people, not just of territory, the security of individuals, not just of nations, security through development, not through arms, security of all the people everywhere, in their homes, in their jobs, in their streets, in their communities, and in their environment, end quote. This new interpretation, he explained, requires us to regard human security as, quote, universal, global, and indivisible, end quote. In other words, it applies equally to all people everywhere and supersedes the notion of so-called national security enforced by military power, in some cases overwhelming military power. It seems to me that the concepts of nonviolence, common security among nations, and human security are complementary and mutually reinforcing. Exactly 1 year before his tragic assassination, in 1967, Dr. King declared, quote, I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered, end quote. The Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, has picked up Dr. King's unfinished work, weaving the interlocking injustices of systemic racism, systemic poverty, environmental devastation, militarism and the war economy, and a distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism that blames poor people for their poverty into one moral fusion campaign. Centered on the needs of the most directly impacted people, the Poor People's Campaign moral budget calls for cutting U.S. military spending by half, including by closing 60% of U.S. foreign military bases, ending wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere, and dismantling and eliminating nuclear weapons. It's worth remembering that coming on the heels of the many civil rights movements, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the women's movement, the gay liberation movement, and the ecology movement, the massive anti-nuclear movement that arose in the 1980s was not single issue. As a strategy and a necessity, this time around, let us work together to understand the common causes of our multifaceted crises as we seek to build the massive, multi-issue, multi-generational, multiracial, international moral fusion movement we will need to overcome systemic violence, including the elimination of nuclear weapons, and build a peaceful, just, sustainable, and inclusive world. Tactically, I think we need to refocus our efforts at the local level in order to raise the visibility of nuclear risks to ordinary people and make them the subject of national discourse. Given the stakes, it is astonishing that nuclear weapons were barely mentioned during the 2020 presidential campaign. Going forward, we need to change that by working where we live to make nuclear weapons a local issue. One way we can do this is by enrolling our mayors in Mayors for Peace. Poor People's Campaign co-chairs Bishop William J. Barber II and Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris dared to put forward a visionary scenario of what this could look like in their February 25th, 2022 statement on Russia's attack on Ukraine. Quote, with the invoking of nuclear weapons, this reckless attack could lead to global disaster. There is, however, a possible alternative to such disaster that comes out of the Gandhian nonviolent tradition. Autocrats fear one thing, and that is a sustained nonviolent mobilization of people. That is why they work so hard to go to war quickly. They don't want to allow such mobilizations to grow and use every means to divide and squash them. We stand with the people of Russia who immediately took to this at great personal risk to nonviolently protest this war. We stand with the people of Ukraine who have been resisting the drive to war and nuclear annihilation. We must pose the question, what if those of us who stand for peace around the world refuse to cooperate with evil? Millions of people, fathers, mothers, grandparents, children, could nonviolently lock arms and build a nonviolent movement for peace, justice, and democracy. Could it be that Ukraine is the Edmund Pettus Bridge of today, where everyone could come together in the open and defeat the autocracy's power with their bodies and their courage to build a worldwide moral stance? The movement for Indian independence and national liberation broke the back of the British Empire by doing that. Other movements have done the same throughout world history. We call forward that spirit again today. Indeed, the entire world must stand against this war and the dangers that it poses to escalate into nuclear violence and the annihilation of existence. As Dr. King said, our choice in the face of nuclear war is not between violence and nonviolence, but rather between nonviolence and non-existence. We hope to choose peace, love, justice, and life, end quote. I hope to have an opportunity to talk more about the Poor People's Campaign and Mayors for Peace during Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Okay, so now I would like to open up the floor for Q&A with our esteemed panelists. So please, if you have a question, please raise your hand virtually or post your question in the chat box and we will call on you. So I see the first person who has raised her hand is Dr. Ivana Hughes of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. So please.
Thank you, Christian. And I really just wanted to begin the discussion, but primarily to thank everybody for being here, to thank Christian for moderating this panel, and to thank John, Jackie, and Andrew for their insightful remarks. It seems to me that this really shouldn't need to be said, but has to be said, and Jackie did a beautiful job. It is possible to condemn both Russia's invasion and to condemn the response of the US and its allies. I think that it is absolutely what has been so difficult for me is the way in which the word peace has almost become a dirty word because we need to take sides. And at the same time, I feel that once you eliminate the word peace as an allowed option and you insist on war, it's only the next logical step that you end up with nuclear weapons use. I've literally talked to people where I say, well, we have to find a way to move towards peace. And they say, no, we have to beat Russia. And I said, well, what if they use nuclear weapons? Well, they probably will. And so to me, these are sort of related. And I wonder how any or all of you would react to this. I'll just add one more point that some of your remarks made me think of, which is that it's been said, and I was like John and Jackie and Christian, I was at the UN for much of August, and even over the last few weeks, it sort of gets repeated over and over and over again that Russia's invasion was unprovoked and unjustified. And it's possible for the invasion to be provoked, but to still be unjustified. I think Noam Chomsky made this point in one of the previous nuclear dangers discussions. And so, to me, the question is, how do we get to how do we argue for peace without sounding like we're taking sides? And how do we conquer really the idea that war is the only way forward and that somehow nuclear weapons use is almost inevitable. So any of you, or if Christian, I don't know if you want to take more questions and then have them addressed. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Ivana. We could do question by question to allow more people to think about their questions, formulate their thoughts. So who would like to respond to Ivana? Yes, Jackie.
Okay, I can start. I mean, basically your question is sort of what I tried to address in my remarks. To me, when I was feeling just despair at the outset of this war, and trying to come to grips with it and trying to figure out what I could say to other people, what came to me was go back to basics, go back to my core moral compass, my core values, nonviolence and human security. And when I apply that lens to the situation, I don't see any good guys out there, really. The potential for being the good guys lies with the people, lies with us. And I do see a potential, the only promising potential for the kind of social movement I think we need is what I see with the Poor People's Campaign, because it is actually grounded in values, the values of nonviolence in the Moral Fusion campaign. And clearly, we have so many problems in the United States and around the world that we need the broadest possible movement, but one that is clearly articulating a vision of a different kind of a future than the powers that be are leading us in. So I've come to the place where, I mean, I have no problem condemning Russia's war of aggression. I've spent my whole life condemning United States aggression, you know? And why should I have a double standard because it's a different country, you know? And to me, that's what it comes down to.
Thank you. Please, John.
Well, if Andy doesn't mind, I'm going to steal something striking he has been saying. And I think he already said it, which is, why aren't there essentially global demonstrations demanding that Russia withdraw from Ukraine? That would be a fabulous, nonviolent response to the current situation. And perhaps it can be stimulated by the fact that there's just an ongoing risk of resort to nuclear weapons. You know, one can have a sophisticated discussion about this and hope that it's bluffing on Russia's part as it denies, but we can't be sure about that. So that's a good enough reason on its own to say this war must be brought to an end. And the most direct route for this war to be brought to an end is for Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. So I think that should be demanded globally. You know, Ivana, concerning, first of all, congratulations on being new president of Nuclear Age, and I have great hopes for Nuclear Age under your leadership. At I'm part of Western States Legal Foundation as well as Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, and off and on we have worked closely with Nuclear Age and hope to continue to do so. But
there's
you know,
picture of you at the bottom of our homepage.
Okay. But I personally have no difficulty whatever, very, very strongly condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine, even though I am fully aware of the various very poor policies that the United States and NATO took towards Russia over the past 2 decades. And that's not only NATO expansion, although I will note regarding that, you know, Putin said in 2007, he said, admitting these Ukraine and Georgia, which for, I don't know, centuries had been considered part of Russia, to NATO was a red line for him. he was quite clear about that. But there were other things happening as well. As I mentioned briefly, there was the precipitous US withdrawal from the ABM treaty. Russia said, okay, you don't like it, let's come up with an alternative arrangement. US response was simple, no. And that has been characteristic of the US approach on other proposals from Russia. Russia says we need to create a new European security arrangement. No. In some cases, not no with an explanation or no, let's try something different, just no. There have been occasions where Russian proposals have simply been ignored. There's a Russian proposal for a moratorium on deployment of intermediate nuclear force missiles in the European area. And as I recall, the US hasn't even bothered to respond to that particular proposal. So I'm fully aware of all of these factors, but I don't have any difficulty condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And, you know, like Jackie and Andy and others on this call, you know, I was a very strong opponent of the US invasion of Iraq. Andy and I wrote a paper or two at the time before the invasion saying it would be illegal. Peter Weiss and I of Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy participated in and helped organize the World Tribunal on Iraq session held in New York City. Yeah, so it's the whole idea that there's some kind of problem with criticizing Russia. I just don't, essentially I don't get.
And I'd like to add a few thoughts to this. The first is, again, we're not governments. Furthermore, there are no mass peace movements. We are not in the position to whisper in the ears of governments. If there are negotiations, we will likely be, like everybody else in the public, the last to know that they have been initiated. These are things we have to keep in mind about the realities of the situation. And it's a question of what do we emphasize? You know, when I see the general run of stuff coming through my email and the webinars and everything else, the fact that this is a war of aggression and must be strongly opposed is about the fifth thing on the list of what gets talked about by many, many, many people in the remnants of the peace movement and on the left. And, you know, it's the thing about law and the illegality of wars of aggression and annexation is really the first principle of the post-World War II international order. And like every other legal order, domestic or international up to now, its rules and institutions were mainly formed by bargains among the rulers of states, the people who were powerful within states. And most of us were at best faint voices outside the walls where we continued to be. But you know what social movements do with law is you hold the existing order to account for their commitments and their claims. And this is the most fundamental commitment that those who rule in the most powerful states have supposedly made to each other and to the rest of us, that they have given up wars of aggression and conquest and annexation. And it's the first and foremost thing that must be spoken out against when it occurs or when it threatens to occur.
Yes, thank you, Andy, and thank you, John and Jackie, for answering Ivana's, commenting on Ivana's thoughts. So I see that we have 3 people who raised their hands. Perhaps we can take all 3 at once. So I would like to, on my list, I have Peter Mitz first. So Peter, please ask your question.
Oh, first, I certainly want to thank the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. We need to have more dialogues like this amongst all the people who are thinking so seriously about it. And this is very constructive. And I really liked what our speakers had to say. I want to pose the following thing. I think we need to think about what we're going to do if the Russian government uses a nuclear weapon or even a dirty bomb, and have a plan for it, and possibly even declare in advance. In fact, there's parts of it, the plan that I can foresee, that I think we should declare in advance. So number 1 is we should declare we're not going to respond in kind. Now, when I say we, I'm talking about the NATO forces. Number 2, I think we ought to say, we're telling you that right now because we think this is such a horrible thing. We're not going to go down that path, but we will find some other ways to deal with the aggression, probably more sanctions or something like that. In fact, it'd be wonderful if we declared that it would not be ways of force, but ways of military force, but ways of other constraints. So I'm offering that, and I don't know how you want to do this, Christian, but if people want to react to that, I'd be delighted. But otherwise, I just want to throw it out there for people to think about. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Peter. I think while our panelists ponder about, muse about, over your thoughts, I think I'll ask Cheryl to ask her question as well. And then we'll turn back to the panelists. So please, Cheryl.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to follow up on Andrew's geopolitical analysis that it's not the people in the countries that are waging these wars, except those that are drafted, of course, but it's the governments. And I just listened earlier today to an interview from the Hoover Institution, which you will all know is quite conservative and right-wing. But they had Mr. McMaster interview Vladimir Milov, who is a Russian anti-Putin person who happens to be here in Palo Alto now. And he is a spokesperson for Alex Navalny, okay? And I'm going to put in the chat, that's been recorded, you can go listen to it. But towards the end, when McMaster asked him, how is this nuclear threat going to evolve? And first of all, he said, Mr. Milov said, the Russians, Putin and the Russians are not so stupid as to let off even a tactical weapon in Ukraine, because the winds will blow the radioactive fallout into Russia. And that part of Russia is in fact where most of their food, a third of their food is grown in that part of Russia that would suffer from the fallout of any nuclear weapon being set off. He thinks that we have to stay calm. We, NATO, the US, everybody else, stay calm, don't blink, don't give Putin an off-ramp, because that would make him say to himself, oh, this blackmail is working. I'm going to make it even stronger blackmail demands. So it's, and we have to depend on the Russian people who he has spoken to over the past many years, thousands of people. They're good people. They want normalcy. They want the rule of law to be followed. They're being fed a whole bunch of propaganda right now, but they're beginning to realize with this call up of 300,000 new recruits, that maybe, you know, some of that propaganda is actually propaganda, and maybe it is a war, and not just a whatever Putin called it in the first place. So he says, you know, please depend on the Russian people. Okay, depend that they will eventually realize they don't want to be in this situation, and you know they'll start to do something about it. So I don't know if any of you. Anyway, I'll put in the chat the link to this very interesting 1-hour interview out of the Hoover Institution. You can take some of it with a grain of salt. Anyway, if anybody else has this, you know, wants to speak to this, I'd be happy to hear. Thank you very much.
Yes, and I believe that we have, yes, so I'm sorry. And we have one more question, and then we will go back to the panels received it in the chat box. Judith Lipton. What do you all think about Pramila Jayapal and the Progressive Caucus's withdrawal of a letter to Biden seeking a ceasefire in Ukraine? Seems like talking about peace is so incendiary that even liberal Dems can't do it. And I'm going to repost that question in the chat box so everyone can see. And yes, so we have 3 points. Who would like to go first amongst our panelists?
Maybe I'll go first on this one.
Yes.
First of all, something notable happened that was you may have noticed if you were reading the Times today. Vladimir Putin spoke at the Valdai Discussion Club, which is a kind of an expert forum that he speaks at periodically. And one of the things that he did was play down any kind of possibility for nuclear weapons use by the Russian government. And the full speech is not available on the President of Russia's site in translation yet, but likely will be soon. So it'll be interesting to see what the context was for those remarks. And, you know, again, in terms of the larger setting, like the United States, Russia is essentially a continental empire with a tremendous kind of inherent war-making capacity. Sanctions, no sanctions, whatever, it can continue this war for against a much smaller country for more or less indefinitely. So the talk of and you know, the Western strategies that say, oh, we're going to strategies of Western governments that we're going to cause the defeat of Russia are kind of illusory in one way. And like the United States, the way that this war is most likely to end is either when the Russian military loses the moral and political will to fight, or when the Russian government reaches the point where it thinks its domestic political risks are greater continuing the war than finding a way to end it. And again, to me, this suggests that making it really clear that publics around the world reject this as a war of aggression is, as peace movements, again, we're not governments, we're not, you know, peace fragments, the most effective thing we can do in terms of trying to push for the end of this war. And again, of course, negotiations at the soonest possible date is something we all should want. But trying to conjecture what deals can be made or how it's going to happen very difficult to do.
Yes, thank you, Andy. Anyone else? John, Jackie?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. First of all, regarding the progressives' withdrawal of their letter, that's really terrible. First of all, that they put out a letter which apparently was written back in July and had not been updated. But secondly, that they then backed down and withdrew it. And you know, clearly there's kind of now sort of a war think mentality in Washington, and that is disturbing. If you it's in some way indicate that the war should be brought to an end, and there might be compromises involved in that, then you're suddenly, you know, sort of a traitor to the heroic Ukrainians. Well, you know, the United States and the American people, they have, and we have our own responsibilities. The United States has a responsibility, the government has a responsibility because it is funding the war, supplying the war. So it has its own responsibilities. So Peter Metz says, well, what to do if Russia uses a nuclear weapon? And briefly at the end of my talk, I was saying that there is now some consideration, you know, among NGOs, but I think among at least some governments, at what could be done in the UN context, like suspending Russian voting rights if Russia were to use a nuclear weapon, and more importantly, what could be signaled to Russia in advance of that. But you know, not using nuclear weapons could be part of demands of the peace movement on Russia, include withdraw from Ukraine, don't use nuclear weapons. You know, sort of speculating about what the actual kind of military strategic situation in it is hard to do, at least unless you have deep access into like Russian inside sources. But still, I would think that the Russian government was serious about saying we will or we might resort to nuclear arms if US and NATO intervened militarily regarding Ukraine. Whether there would really seriously contemplate doing a nuclear use in any other circumstance, I don't know. And it could be that this is sort of a fog of war type thing that Putin and co are doing. They're bombing civilian infrastructure and electricity generation distribution in Ukraine quite effectively, it seems. But meanwhile, sort of diverting attention by talking about dirty bombs and might nuclear weapons be used. Jackie, did you have anything?
I think Jackie may have.
Oh, did we lose her? Okay.
We may have lost her. So I know that Judith Lipton, who asked that question, her hand is raised. Would you like to take the floor, Judith?
Sure, thank you very much. I don't think my question was exactly answered. And there are 2 points I'd like to make. One is, I really support what Jackie said about coming out and talking about peace, nonviolence, and security, and doing something, I don't know what to call it, maybe active activism, beyond the kind of thinking conversations we're having today. I think Jackie's write about the Poor People's Campaign, about joining with other groups, to promote this cause. I also think Peter's right to raise the question that we should have an answer collectively, maybe as parts of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. I think we should commit not to retaliating if a country, whether Russia or some other, uses a nuclear weapon. I think non-retaliation in kind is something we should talk about and commit to. That instead of an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, using a nuclear weapon, I believe, by anyone, should trigger a whole bunch of bad stuff for the perpetrator. But it's perfectly legitimate, I believe, not to respond to evil with evil. I think we should, as collectively, make that a commitment and support a non-nuclear response, no matter what happens, come what may. Thank you. I'm glad you're doing this conference, and I'm glad to be here.
Yes, thank you, Judith. Now, Jackie, it looks like you're back. Would you like to respond?
Yeah, I'm sorry I got dropped. Yeah, I mean, for years, for decades, we have been saying there should, you know, nothing justifies a nuclear weapons use, even a nuclear weapons use. It couldn't possibly make the situation better. So I'm right there with you on that. I wanted to respond to Cheryl's point. I don't know if Cheryl's still with us, but I appreciate the fact that she's looking for other various sources and perspectives to try to form an opinion. And I think that we need to be doing more of that. So I thank you for that, Cheryl. And I wanted to point out that a few of our groups put out a statement of U.S. anti-war support for Russian opposition to the war in Ukraine. I'm read the opening paragraph. As U.S. citizens, we actively oppose the illegal and inhumane U.S. military interventions in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, many family division, social alienation, violence, and exile. We affirm our support for and solidarity. Peacefully oppose and resist their government's military conscription and illegal, inhumane war of aggression in Ukraine. And then, fortunately, we're in touch with persons who have left Russia as well as the war. Our statement and signatures through these means is
We're losing her again.
Jackie, I think we're losing you.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I have a poor connection. I'm going to put this in the chat, but I also support. I think it was Sharon, yes, who was talking about the
Jackie, again.
Direct way that we can do that.
You know, John may want to elaborate on this, but I think he made it fairly clear in his opening presentation that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is generally illegal, and not just illegal in the context of being associated with the war of aggression. So advocating no nuclear weapons use in response to a nuclear weapons use, I think, is a completely appropriate thing to do. And perhaps John would like to say a bit more about this.
Yes, John.
I agree with what you say, Andy. That, you know, the rules of warfare apply to both sides, and so use of a nuclear weapon second or third is illegal, just as a first use of nuclear weapons is illegal. And as a side point, that's one of the difficulties I have with the NGO campaigning for no first use. But, you know, I realized that something that Peter Metz said deserves a reply. You know, he said that the Biden administration has been talking about a response to a Russian nuclear use, which response would have catastrophic consequences for Russia. And yet, I have the sense that it could depend on the circumstances, but still I have the sense that the Biden administration is not really thinking about a nuclear response to Russian nuclear use. But one thing that gets lost, you know, in like the punditry is if the US and NATO joined the war militarily in response to a Russian nuclear use, that would also escalate the risks, including the risks of nuclear war. So there are no sort of simple, easy answers to these problems.
Yes, thank you, John. So now we'll have another round of Q&A. So on my list we have Sandra, Dale, and Karen. So Sandra, please. Oh, you are muted. You're still muted. Sorry, Sandra, I think you're still muted. No, unfortunately.
Oh, right.
There we go.
Is that better?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yes, I just want to say that this particular war is harder really for the peace movements in the West because Russia has committed this aggression that they have committed. But I think that I don't think we are very effective if we demonstrate to kind of tell Russia what to do, if you know what I mean. There have been lots of demonstrations actually in the West, you know, for Ukraine and all the rest of it. And this is really just, it seems to be firing the war really, because we're just supporting our side in military action actually against Russia. So it doesn't really do much for Russia, you see. So I think really that, you know, we are responsible, the West, have to look to what we're doing and what we can do and what our role is. And so that even though we do condemn the aggression, we have to think, what is it we can do to defuse the war, you know, because, and in other ways, give an off-ramp to Russia, because Russia is in this very difficult position with someone as mad as Putin, and they're not going to give in easily, and they may resort to nuclear weapons. So, although there was actually a statement by the Russian ambassador last night to say that they wouldn't use them. So what I'm really saying is, I think that it's the West's responsibility to defuse the war in any way that we can. And this would mean immediate ceasefire, because the West is not agreeing to a ceasefire at the moment, immediate ceasefire and negotiations, and looking very, very seriously at neutrality, because on its own, neutrality is a very safe, it is a very rigorous agreement, and it's a very safe position to be in. And it's really the ideal for all nations in the world to be in this position. So that I think the West just needs to look at how it can diffuse the war, because we don't have any control over the Russian government, we have control over our own government. And for instance, there's a peace movement in the main one in the United Kingdom, and their slogan is "Stop the war, Russian troops out, no NATO expansion, no nuclear war." This to me sums the whole thing up really, and it shows that both sides are in it together. You know, both and it's up to us to pressure our government to defuse the war in the way we can. And I think we can do it by putting pressure, by not supplying Zelensky with and infinite number of weapons, which we're doing at the moment, but putting a limit on them. Otherwise, it's the tail wagging the dog sort of thing. You know, Zelensky is telling us what to do, and he doesn't seem to care whether there's a war in Europe or not. You know, a wider war, he said things to that effect, really. So it's the West's responsibility to limit Zelensky, and instead of possibly encouraging the fight, limit his means and give a very strong pressure on neutrality, so that we can really get somewhere in negotiations. So first, the West must cease fire and negotiate, and then it must put pressure on Zelensky to diffuse the war in the way that he can. For instance, if they go to territories that were under their control when the war started, that would be a big a way of diffusing it, actually. So there are many things one can do in negotiation. And also, I think Elon Musk's suggestions were really quite good as well, and these should all be considered. So I'm just saying that I think that we need to put pressure on our government, and the way we can do it is by saying we must negotiate now, immediate ceasefire, and negotiations, and both sides have to make sacrifices for this, really. So I think I've probably made my point now. I hope you can.
Thank you, Sandra. So next, Dale.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this seminar, and I wanted to respond to the question about why the peace movement was not responding in a universal manner with this, aside from our many marches in support of, I'm sorry, I can't really do my video. I can try. There, I got the top of my head. Okay, thank you. I'm sitting in the middle of a snowstorm, so a little bit different, in Western Canada on Treaty 4 territory, which is the land of the Cree, Nakota, Dakota, Sioux, and Lakota. The question was the peace movement's response, and part of it was that many people involved. I'm also a member of IPPNWC, the Canadian version of International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, and is that many of us have been horrified at the continued attempts of NATO to do for its exercises in Europe, which almost bordered on the Russian borders itself. And it's a little bit difficult, I think, for the peace movement and those in the Europe as well to suddenly do a turnaround and say, no, we got to get, now we have to oppose Russia. So I think there was a bit of a problem with the double think there. I have always, when I was a child, I had an aunt who lost a husband in the First World War and a son in the Second, and was decidedly opposed to war. She is very unusual in our community and virtually ostracized. But one of the things she said, whenever you see a war, follow the money. And there's a lot of people, certainly in both our countries, I'm in Canada and the United States, who are making a lot of money off selling weapons and guidance systems from our country to the Ukraine. So I'm quite in favor of Sandra Jacobs' suggestion that we quit arming either side. And but I've also been wondering, through all of the discussions that we have had, is why we haven't looked at some of the ways in which wars have been stopped in the past. I think immediately of how the Danish people survived Nazi invasion without, actually by surrendering, but then engaging in an incredible non-cooperative program. So I guess I wonder, how could we assist the Ukrainians or the Russians in reaching the negotiation tables by doing some of these kinds of things. Oh.
Thank you so much, Dale. And then finally, Karen.
Thank you. I'm from Sweden, by the way, and I feel appalled by many things. First of all, I think we have to move from deterrence to common security. And I'm a teacher of conflict resolution. So I feel very bad every day in this situation we are. The tension increases by the day. And you, I think here, there's speakers, apart from Jackie. I agree with Sandra Jacobs, by the way. Apart from Jackie, taking it too slow. And also listening to Navalny's spokesman's advice is not very good, because here we might easily get into a nuclear war because of this tension. There are nuclear wars possibility by mistake, and that is greater when there is increased tension. What we have to do is to listen to the needs from Russia also, although of course this is illegal war and is terrible in all senses of the word. But we have to see to the consequences here, and this is a chicken race, and we have to see that there is a need for Russians also to feel security, and they explain it easily about common security, like Olof Palme did. And we should take this very seriously and, of course, adjust to it. And NATO should not get close to the borders, and especially not in Ukraine. It's very dangerous there. And Sweden should not join NATO. It will increase the tension here. And we have to only think how you solve conflicts, see all the perspectives, see why is there a war here, etc., etc. So I'm very, very frightened there will be a nuclear war. So I can't, although my English is not as such as yours, I feel I need to open my mouth. So I have done this at least. And also I got out into the streets, and we are people here who don't want to join NATO, and Ukraine should not do it, and it would be possible to take a step back and at least wait and see, and not invite Ukraine into NATO now, because it's very dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. This was the last round of questions from the audience, so I would like to turn now to our esteemed panelists to see if they would like to make any comments or concluding remarks.
Maybe I'll start it off. I agree, for example, with a statement like "Stop the War" that makes stopping the illegal war and withdrawal of forces a first demand, but also talks about the other parts of this. And I agree completely that further NATO expansion, including Sweden, Finland, the exercises in the middle of this war, both the conventional, large-scale conventional exercises and the nuclear exercises should have been called off. I mean, earlier on, actually, in the course of the Ukraine war, the United States was making a point of canceling scheduled exercises of nuclear delivery systems and so forth as potentially provocative, a policy they should have continued and should continue. And, you know, the US nuclear posture review apparently is out today, and I've only seen a little bit of reporting on it. But, you know, again, you have a very ambiguous policy about nuclear use and the continuation of the modernization programs and so on. And you know, again, we don't have a strong peace movement. And my feeling is that, you know, all of the social transformations that are necessary to reduce the causes of war must be nonviolent. And we need this war to end to make the space for those to happen. And we need to start thinking, because again, we don't have strong peace movements now, about the issues we're going to have to confront after the war ends. And, you know, in Europe, again, some kind of common security is going to be essential, but it's not going to be easy because once again, particularly after this aggression by the government and military of Russia, the countries that are frontline states for NATO, their security, the security of those people are also going to have to be taken into consideration. And perhaps most difficult in terms of the deeper drivers of war, I don't think we're going to get a stable common security regime in Europe or anywhere else without fairly fundamental social change. A lot of places here in Europe, in the United States, in large parts of the world. And, you know, I'll end, one of the most cogent things that has been said about this war so far was said just before it started by by Ambassador Martin Kamani of Kenya in the Security Council debate about this war. And what he said is, we must complete our recovery from the embers of dead empires in a way that does not plunge us back into new forms of domination and oppression. And that's a tall order, but that's our task if we really want to have any kind of world that is stably at peace.
Thank you, Andy. John, Jackie?
I'll just make one comment. Sandra Jacobs said that demonstrations demanding that Russia withdraw from Ukraine might not necessarily affect the thinking of those who make decisions in Russia. So I was had a similar thought just 10 days ago. And then Putin cited critics of the war and sort of apologists for Russia in one of his speeches or one of his press conferences, that they're very aware of the essentially of the support for Russia that comes from outside of Russia, Europe and the West, I think he's talking about. So, I think we should take that seriously and take our ability to affect Russian behavior seriously. And I want to, again, thank Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and Christian in particular for organizing this event. It's been a good conversation.
Thank you so much, John. Jackie?
Oh, goody, I get the last word. One thing I think we need to think more about is Ukraine's agency. When we're talking about leaning on our own governments, because we can't affect the Russian government. And Ukraine should do this and Ukraine should do that. But we have to think about Ukraine's agency in this also. I don't think we've given it enough thought. I want to also point out that, and I will say that I have been actively opposed to NATO for at least 30 years. I went to Strasbourg and got seriously tear gassed in a demonstration when they were meeting in Strasbourg and so on. So I don't feel like I need to apologize for anything I'm saying about this, but Russia also conducted military exercises, including nuclear drills, around the same time as the US was doing Steadfast Noon. So again, this is not doublethink. We need to criticize both of them, I think. Yeah, again, I'm just going to go back to, oh yes, and in line with what John said, and the petition, the statement that I posted, we actually have the ability to get this statement distributed in Russia. This is a statement of support for the Russian war resistors, and I really encourage people to sign it, because we are in touch with the Northwest Russian anti-war movement, and we're also closely in touch with the Ukrainian pacifist movement. So, you know, I think we need to let our peers in Russia know, and in Ukraine know, that we are standing with them in their opposition to the war. And that is a way that maybe we can influence the Russian government. And finally, along the lines of what John said, I found this to be very shocking. There's a Russian, a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Vladimir Kozin, who sends out bulletins essentially presenting the Russian government's views on a daily basis. And in the most recent one, he said, Moscow appeals to the world anti-nuclear movements and organizations to take an active and effective part in a new type anti-nuclear campaign aimed at stopping nuclear warmongers now settled down in Ukraine. And he's talking about, I think, the Russian allegations about unfounded, as far as I can tell, about Ukrainian plans to produce a dirty bomb. So this is, the plot thickens. Again, I think it's hard to overestimate how complex and multi-layered and murky this all is. And that's why, again, I always come back to basic principles. So again, for me, nonviolence, human security, and I'll put common security in there as well, because I think that those three concepts work very well together. And I will also say that, I mentioned that there's a quote that I often read from Gandhi, which is not well known, where he talks about how nonviolence has to come from the bottom up and someday become a matter of national practice. And when some nation dares to take on that mantle fully, it will have earned the respect of other countries in the world, and it will have taken great risks to get there. And I think, again, instructions for us, bottom up nonviolence, is where we need to make this a fundamental cultural change. And I haven't had time to talk about Mayors for Peace, but I would just say that promotion culture of peace is part of its platform. And what that means is getting individuals everywhere to care about peace and to make it a personal issue for them.
Yes, thank you so much, Jackie. So on that note, I would like to conclude, but before we all leave, I would like to ask everyone to turn on their cameras so we can take a group photo. I'm going to ask our wonderful intern, Megan, to take the photo.
Okay, I took it.
Oh, wait. So say one, two, three, Megan. Unmute yourself. It's
okay. All right, 1, 2, 3.
There are 4 pages of people she's got to take.
2 pages on my screen. So we're just taking, yes, taking the pictures. So I think we're good. I'll just take one more. So 1, 2, 3. And 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you everyone for attending this event, and we will be in touch soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you so much. Well done.
Thank you. you.
Save the chat. Lots of good things.
Bye.
In the
Thank you
chat.
so much.
Bye.
Save the chat.
Thank you.
And the texts.
Great job, Christian.
Really
Thank
great
you.
job. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Love to have the text of the speeches.
Yes, yes, and we will share the recording as well.
There's so much good information in there. Would appreciate it greatly. Hi, John. Hi, Andrew.
There's work to do.
Yes. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Indeed.